Hi there and welcome to another chapter reading for Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Today I will be reading from Hero High, Heartbreak Rebellion by Mina, Chara. Prologue. In the year 1930, the world experienced strange lights in the sky. Comet gone rogue fell into Earth's orbit and pounded our blue planet with bright shooting stars. In that same year, ordinary men and women began to exhibit superhuman power, and by 1939 the connection was clear. In the moments before death, the comet seemed to choose those with an overwhelming desire to live. Object D/1930X1 was named the Heroic Comet. In the war-torn age that followed, those affected by the comet saved thousands, but life in peacetime wasn't easy. One hero, Stronghold, found the solution. He designed and built Icon City, an island home where superhumans from across the world could live in peace without fear of persecution. By 1950, the world knew the gifts bestowed by the heroic comet could be used for evil as well as good. Some wartime heroes turned to crime, and this sent the world into panic. In 1959, as the champions, Earth's greatest, most famous heroes prepared to retire, the International Heroes Group was formed. Their mission was simple: recruit and initiate fledgling superhumans into a world that demanded discipline and nobility. Over time, new heroes and villains arose. In 1979, Captain Fantastic joined their ranks as he battled the most desperate villain of all, Dr. Dangerous. The two clashed for many years, until the Doctor's actions grew more and more gruesome and the public demanded action. In 1986, Captain Fantastic shouldered a burden no one else could. He killed Dr. Dangerous on live television and gave himself up to the police. 1 year later, his plea of self-defence was upheld, and Captain Fantastic, now even more beloved, was released. He spent the next 5 years urging the world to keep a close eye on heroes through a dedicated television channel, and as part of his efforts, he opened a school where the next generation of superhuman heroes could be trained. He called it Hero High. I grew up with stories of Hero High and the heroes who got passed through its doors. Now I get to write the story of my hero. Miss Fitzsimmons, I'm so happy to see you again, I say, as Friday smiles and shakes my hand. Her face is square, hair puffy, smile broad, chin cleft and eyes round, big and deep set. Claire, it's good to see you again. I thought I told you to call me Friday. Oh yes, sorry, I giggle, as I take the same seat as last year. The air is sticky and humid, but it's cool inside the family cafe. So you're here for another story? Friday asks as someone comes through the door and orders a box of macaroons. I nod. Okay, same deal, as much detail as possible, she laughs. I pull up my pad and recorder. Yes, of course. Chapter 1. Good Love. Steamy rain pounded on my window and the smell of warm damp air spread through the room. I sat up. Sleeping had been pointless since December. Sure, my legs hurt in every place they'd been broken, and the doctor said my backache was due to stress. I'd my crooked nose, the fact that part of my spine was now fake, and I wasn't in the best condition. That wasn't a problem. Closing my eyes, that was the thing I couldn't do. I don't want to start this on such a low note, but in those days I had a big problem. I couldn't sleep out of fear of closing my eyes. I spent months in a coma while my body fixed itself. Some people will tell you a person in a coma can hear you. Maybe they can. I assume it's different for everyone. For me, it had been a prison of darkness, and I couldn't go back to it. Something hit my window. I leaned forward to see a figure outside, tall, Ashley. I stood as he knocked on the glass. I was 40 floors up. How in the... He wiggled his grappling hook, and I crossed my arms. Just because he showed up didn't mean I had to let him in. He frowned and raised his fist to rap on the balcony window again. Ashley and I hadn't spoken in a few weeks, not since he'd been taken away. I sighed and flung the sheets away, and with my bare feet padding against the floor, I opened the balcony door for him. He smiled as he stepped in, and I dived forward to wrap my arms around him. He wobbled, but put his arms around me all the same. Not what I expected, he said. as he turned my face to meet his, and I shrugged. Ever since people had figured out he was Dr. Dangerous, or at least the newer version of Dr. Dangerous, Ashley had lived at the villain school. For obvious reasons, he'd taken his mother's surname. His father, the original Dr. Dangerous, was French, slight and very blonde. His mother, in contrast, was Chinese. I didn't know much about her other than what she'd tried to do the previous year. Ashley looked nothing like his father. Maggie, his grandmother, on his mother's side, said he looked like her husband. I didn't have the energy to turn him away. My forehead fell onto his chest with exasperation. A moment passed. "I missed you," he said. His voice wavered and he tried to smile again. "Did something happen?" I whispered. I stood still as his chest danced up and down. He was trying not to cry. Ashley, of all people. "I can't tell you," he said. "Is it your mother?" I asked, pulling back. "She's not the same. She's not who she used to be. Ever since I got powers," I held him closer. I wanted to tell him to forget about her, but I knew it was pointless. "Want to go out for a walk?" I asked. My bones felt restless. He looked up at me, his eyes sparkling with unused tears. "A walk? Unless you want to stay here." "No," he said. "I'd forget to leave early and you'd be in trouble if they thought we'd spent the night together." He leaned back and I released him. "No, a walk sounds nice." I pulled on a jacket. It was nearly midnight. Ashley climbed out of the window again and I opened my bedroom door. People would wonder where I was going on the other side of the cameras. Luckily, they kept no cameras in bedrooms, only in hallways and classrooms. So I looked up to the one in the elevator and shrugged. I hurried out, pulling my hood up, the warm air hitting me, and walked a block or two to where we planned to meet. There was no sign of him. I looked around in the humidity, the blaring lights of Icon City, the world's grandest tourist trap. I could see the Captain and Dr. Dangerous's statue not far off. The superstructure glowed in the distance. The King Industries building sat not too far away. The King building was taller and thinner, made for work, intimidation, not selling hero-branded perfume or French fries. It all blurred together like watching a carousel. There was never a moment Icon City wasn't moving. I loved it in spite of everything. Then I felt a tap on my shoulder. Ashley. Unlike me, Ashley Young was extremely tall and kind of lanky. His nose was straight, too straight to look normal. His face shaped like a heart, long and horsey. His lips were puffy and his eyes were sharp, not in shape but in nature. His hair was black and as straight as a bar of steel. The tone of his skin, always warm, even warmer now summer was coming. When we met, I thought he was weird looking. It's true, no one part of his face is simple, and every feature had something to say. That's what I liked about it. "Can I hold your hand now?" he asked. I looked back to the superstructure. We were far enough away. I smiled, reached out, and as my hand wrapped in his, my chest warmed. No one would see us. I looked up out of the corner of my eye. We weren't brave enough to look directly at each other. We wandered along the city streets, listening to the sounds of passing cars and wrinkling our noses at the fumes from their engines. The smell of baked fish wafted from countless restaurants, and my index finger rubbed circles on the back of his hand. The pads of his fingers were hard and flat. There were fresh burns on his skin, along with those that had faded. Ashley took my hand, still wrapped in his, and tucked it in his jacket pocket. A warmth enveloped it. A super-powered kind of warmth. His kind. He was a human heater. I pushed closer, holding on to his arm, and we both smiled childish, happy smiles. "What do you want to do first?" I asked him. He looked around at the people in the shops and pointed across the street. "A sign over there says free food tasting. Want to go in and listen to me complain?" Yes, I do," I giggled. We looked both ways before crossing the street and wandered into a large restaurant. They had a buffet laid out, though at this hour most of the food was already gone. A chef stood behind the tables, and behind that were people tasting cakes and oysters. Ashley pulled me over to the meat, a steak, chopped up into small pieces, with toothpicks embedded in each one. I popped one into his mouth and he did the same to me. It seemed fine, but Ashley spat it out on a napkin, overcooked and basically like rubber. The chef's eyes darted toward us, but he remained stoic as someone else tasted the steak. I left Ashley's arm and rushed over to the pizza and picked up a slice just as Ashley came up behind me. Ever cooked pizza? I asked him, looking over my shoulder. Of course. Is it floppy? I held it up and pointed end dangled downwards. Ashley leaned into my ear so the chef wouldn't hear. Good pizza isn't floppy, he told me. I wrapped it up like a burrito and took a quick bite before Ashley took it from me and did the same. He leaned down again, his mouth still mostly full. Mediocre at best. I bet he cooked it in a regular oven. He smacked his lips together as he swallowed, like he was trying to figure something out. I think he used canned tomato sauce. I bet he didn't even make it from scratch. Ashley shook his head and I could barely hold back a laugh. The chef was glaring at us. I moved on to the desserts and picked up a piece of cake. This was the first one I could tell was bad. Well, Ashley said, there's nothing there. It's like taking a bite of air with sugar on top. There's no substance, I grumbled. He nodded at me, almost proud. Last were some chocolates. We each picked one up and banged them together in a mock cheers before popping them into our mouths. They were horrible. Bitter, too much sugar. They tasted like vomit. That's no exaggeration. They were awful. Ashley picked up a napkin, spat his out, and then held out another for me. If you don't like it, get out, yelled the chef. It's not my fault they're bad, Ashley replied. The chef waved over security and Ashley grabbed my hand as we ran back out into the cold street. We could still hear the man yelling from the front door as we ran off. It was then I saw the glowing silver sign of Icon City's Museum of Heroes. The doors are open 24/7. I still have no idea how they managed it. The place was never empty. What about the museum? I asked. What if people recognise us? He replied, and he was right. The crowds will be thin at this time of night. We might be recognised, especially when the only visitors were super nerds like me. Well, I mean, it's not that weird. We're friends, I said. He nodded slowly. Right, we can go out as friends. We moved up the never-ending flight of steps to the doors. To get in, you had to pass under Stronghold, who stood etched in gold, embedded in the building, facing everyone who walked in. You don't think Stronghold built this museum, do you? Ashley wondered. He built the city. He didn't build the museum. He wasn't exactly the kind of man to do that. I took a gulp of air. Besides, this was built in the 80s. He was already dead by then. You know when this was built? Why am I not surprised? Ashley said with a sigh as he paid for 2 tickets. Sure I do. I wanted to reach for his arm again, lean on him as we walked in and descended the escalator that moved down through the rotating, glowing comet. Remembering where we were, I moved back and as the escalator led us to the bottom, felt a wave of cold come over me. Air conditioning. I pulled Ashley over to the Hall of Reverence, where wax figures of the very first heroes sat behind glass cases. That's the captain's mum and dad, right? Ashley asked. Yep. His mum was in charge of Dead Company. His dad joined her. He developed his powers during the war. I almost skipped further down the hall, Ashley following with a gentle smile. He paused to look down at the plaque in front of each wax figure, his brow furrowing. It doesn't say what their powers were, he pointed out. I skipped back over to him as he looked to me for the answer. He knew I knew. Nobody knows what their powers were. It was a closely guarded wartime secret. All we know is that they were amazing and devastating, I told him. Ashley nodded, a laugh jolting his body. In other words, they were crap and no one wanted the enemy to know. Basically, I laughed as Ashley shook his head. We felt bad for cracking jokes in front of the captain's mother, who amazingly was still alive. We looked at the patches Dead Company had and at the pictures of the first appearance of the heroic comet. Ashley wandered into the next hall, decorated with red and gold, the captain's colours. My face lit up. I knew it did because I could feel my face muscles starting to ache from too much smiling. I took Ashley's hand without thinking and pulled him towards the very first belt the captain had, back when no one knew what he'd grow up to be. I read the plaque and then pulled back. I looked up at Ashley, his eyes on nothing in the room save for me. Sorry, I forgot. We can go to a different hall. Why? Because he killed my dad? I was trying not to think about that. Sorry, I muttered. He smiled at me again. Don't be. He moved closer and people were shuffling around us. You really love this stuff, don't you? I nodded and his smile came back full force. What do you love? I said, shuffling closer. I felt as though I hadn't stopped smiling for over an hour. Ashley's head hung and came back to look me in the eye as close as he could. Cooking, Very long video games and not much else. Maybe I can cook you something when we get back. I'd like that, I replied, bouncing on my heels. I wanted to hold his hand again, but the hall was filling up, and a girl pointed towards us. Looks like they found us, he grumbled. I shrugged as the flash of a phone camera winked in the corner of my eye. Where do you want to go next? We could go look at all the other hero projects from other countries, I told him. Another camera flashed as Ashley pulled back and mulled over my suggestion. We could see that documentary, he said, pointing to the poster hanging on the floor above us. He checks his watch, the one I'd fixed a year earlier. It's just started, let's go. He almost reached for my hand again, but remembering the camera phones around us, we settled for standing side by side. I wasn't sure why he wanted to see the documentary, but we went in and bought some popcorn and chocolates with our tickets. Need some help with that? Ashley asked. I shook my head, tongue reaching for the popcorn that lay on the very top. He laughed for what must have been the 10th time that night, and it was the most wonderful warm sound I'd ever heard. It made me giggle. The moment we fell into our seats in the dark of the theatre, I realised why we'd come and wished I hadn't brought so much food. I'd ruined the privacy of a dark room with snacks. We sat at the very back, and there were only a few people scattered around, and I found myself wondering what had brought them out so late at night. Were they running from something? Had they planned to come so late? Were they having trouble sleeping like me? I took the popcorn between us as a man on the screen began to talk about the heroic comment. Ashley took a handful of popcorn. He'd settled with actually watching the movie, even though I'd wised up as to why we were here. No, I shoved the popcorn to the side of us on an empty seat and reached for his hand in the dark. His fingers were warm as he took hold of mine, and his thumb rubbed the back of my hand and he let out a gentle sigh. I felt so light, so happy, my head dropped against his shoulder. Things weren't exactly perfect. Jake was in prison, my nose was wonky, and at least one of my teeth was false because of him, not to mention the night terrors. Things were still rough, but this, well, it was a remedy, of sorts. I felt Ashley shift beside me as he looked down and slid back in his seat so he could make himself a little shorter and rest his head on mine. I don't think I'd ever smiled so much in my life, and my face hurt from it all. You're not eating any popcorn, he told me. Popcorn was too big. It was coming between us, I said, and he laughed as I reached under my knee for the chocolates. Want some? I asked. He nodded, his hair mixing with mine. I took out a round milk chocolate crunch ball. He held his mouth open and I slipped it between his lips. He grabbed the box of chocolates from me and did the same thing. The documentary was easy to ignore, like an obnoxious teacher or mindless adverts. We spent the next hour and a half holding hands, feeding each other and kissing. Ashley had decided that cheek kisses were his favourite. Just to make sure, he'd had me kiss his forehead, his jaw and the spot under his ear, but he told me they all paled in comparison. Once the documentary was over, we wandered around the rest of the museum. We both wished we were back in a dark theatre, able to hold hands and kiss in private. The lack of contact stung, so we finished up in the gift shop and set out into the streets once again. Sunrise was just below the horizon. We moved off into the crowds and Ashley tucked my hand in his pocket once again. No one would notice us in a crowd. What now? I asked. Ashley swallowed and stopped. I shook in the cold air. He fumbled around in his pocket, his breathing irregular until he pulled his fist out, hiding something under his fingers. I wanted to give you something. Nana gave it to me too. He took a deep breath. I looked back and forth between his fist and his face. He opened his hand and held it up to me. Inside it was a ring, the most beautiful ring I'd ever seen. 3 stones in a small, intricate band. I swallowed hard. I love you, he said. What? I'm not proposing or anything. He took a deep breath. Want you to have it because I love you. That sounds exactly like a proposal, I whispered. Friday, you're focusing on the wrong thing. What? I looked up. I told you I loved you. He waited and I waited. My cheeks felt wet. My eyes were like ponds. I opened my mouth but nothing came out. My body fought with itself. My heart danced until it seemed it would burst and then a voice screamed at me, calling me stupid. I hugged him. I nearly toppled him over, as though we'd been separated and I'd seen him in a crowd. It took a moment, but he wrapped his arms around me. I soaked up the sensation and pulled back to see tears in his eyes. Ashley, I croaked. He held out his hand. The ring sat in the centre. I want you to have it. Are you sure? You're crying. You're crying too, he said, and his face twisted like there was a pane of glass between us. I'm happy. They're happy tears, I said, laughing. Good. He took the ring in one hand, slipped it on onto one of my fingers and stared at it. I stared at him. He took my hand. I'll take you back. Did I do something wrong? I took a deep breath and slowed. I'd say it to him. Ashley, look, no, he blurted out, and I stopped, taken aback. He turned with an apologetic smile as he rubbed the back of his head. Sorry, I just mean when you're ready. You don't need to say it just because I did. He smiled. I nodded, and his hand tightened on mine as we walked back. I moved in my seat as Friday laughed a little to herself. So people had found out Ashley was Dr. Dangerous? Yes. And they'd really taken him away? I asked. Friday nods. After the medal ceremony, one week they were giving me a medal, and the next they were dragging him off to villain school. She takes a sip of her drink and shakes her head. Video of us, she coughs, circulated again. I checked its views on VidStream the day I woke up. The video of you two kissing? I asked. Friday blushes. Yes. How many views? Nearly 1 billion. Can you believe it? Nearly 1 billion people had seen it by then. It's almost up to 3 billion now. I nod to her. It didn't take people long to figure out, even in the low light, that it was Ashley, or that his wig was a wig. The internet's amazing, isn't it? It must have been a shock, I say. It was. 1 minute he was there, and the next he was gone. Tell me more about the villain school, I asked. It's not a thing anymore. It was barbaric. When the villain school was established, they mostly trained people who wanted to be heels. Heels, I interrupt quickly. Like in wrestling. Every season some wrestlers get picked to play the bad guys. They're called heels. The villains from the villain school mostly menace the kids at Hero High. While the working heroes took on real villains, all of this, the whole story, I mean, it started because of a heel. You might have heard of him. His name was Short Fuse. Thank you for listening to the reading of these chapters. I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you want to know more, feel free to look the book up. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.